Hello and welcome to today's CUGC user share. My name is Stephanie Boozer. I'm with CUGC HQ, and I'm happy to have with us today Esther Barthel and Dave Brett. Going to be talking to us about boosting NetScaler automation with NITRO and PowerShell. And I really want to call this fun with Esther and Dave because I think it's going to be a really great presentation. I think you guys will enjoy it. Before I hand things over to them, just want to give you guys a brief intro. So Esther is a CTP and a Microsoft MVP, and she's also a member of the CUGC Content Working Group, which helps drive our content decisions on the CUGC website, and that includes webinars like this, our blog posts, everything about CUGC. And she's also a mentor with our Women in Tech group, so I'm happy to have her with us today. And also Dave Brett, he is a CTP and a Nutanix technology champion. Dave is a leader of the CUGC networking SIG and heavily involved there as well. So happy to have them both back. They've been webinar presenters for us in the past, so I know they're going to be great today. While they're presenting, if you have any questions, we'd like you to type those into the question panel over to the right. Some of those we'll get to during the presentation and some of those we'll get to afterwards. Just depends on what the questions are and how the flow goes. But do type them in as you have them and we'll keep an eye on them throughout. And also one final note that this presentation is being recorded and you'll receive a link to the recording tomorrow via email. And that will come directly from GoToWebinar, so be on the lookout for that. And now I am ready to hand things over to Dave and Esther. Esther, I am sending you the screen right now.
Yes. So good evening, everyone, or good morning, depending on the time zone that you're in. If all's well, you should be able to see my screen. And let me just get the presentation started. So today we're going to talk about NetScaler Management with NITRO. Even though Stephanie did a great job introducing me and Dave, I'll just do a quick introduction myself, just to get started and get the first nerves out of the way. So I've been in consulting, technical consulting for over 20 years now. Started my own company about over a year ago. Still doing a lot of implementation, troubleshooting, and as Stephanie already mentioned, being heavily involved in different community programs like CTP, MVP, and the Women in Technology Mentorship Program, which I'm very proud of being one of their leaders. And if we're looking at my professional accomplishments, the last couple of years have been mostly focused on DevOps automation. And I got the honorary title from Dave being the NITRO Queen with all the NetScaler automation that I'm doing. Talking about Dave, this evening we have Dave on a call as well. And I'm not sure if he wants to introduce himself because basically... Okay, cool. Because you kind of told me you want to have like a small part this evening and kind of stay in the background. So go ahead, Dave.
Similar to Esther, got around 20 years of technical consulting, design, implement, and troubleshooting. I've worked with various other community programs like the CTP program. I'm one of the leaders of the CUGC networking SIG and a Nutanix NTC. I also do a lot of automation with NetScaler using NITRO and PowerShell. And when Esther and I were talking about this, Esther's obviously got a whole bunch of good content to present today, and the idea of both of us doing it is so that we can keep the session as interactive as possible. So as Stephanie said earlier, if you get the questions over, we're going to try and answer as many as we can during the presentation while Esther's presenting today. And if there's something that requires Esther's input that we can't answer immediately, then we can interrupt the presentation at a suitable point and get that answered straight away and make it as interactive as we can. So in essence, we were talking just before that I'm acting as Esther's minion today, which will be good fun.
Definitely. So let's immediately just start with the fun. I know I get very excited talking about NetScaler Automation. So I'm very happy that Dave will slow me down in some occasions and make sure that I extend some of the information, or make sure that I answer some of the questions that pop up during all my enthusiastic explanations. So a quick glance at the agenda for this webinar is that, as always, I want to start with a small introduction to make sure that everyone is on the same page regarding RESTful APIs and NITRO and NetScaler Management. And then we'll dive right into NetScaler Automation, show you some examples of how you can automate NetScaler ADM functionality, to make sure that you have a centralized way to manage your NetScaler configurations. So without further ado, let's start with the introduction on REST APIs and NITRO. I hope that most of you are already familiar with REST APIs. And for those that are not, here's just a quick rundown of what they are and how we are using them in our demos. So RESTful APIs are based on a client-server architecture, and mostly based on HTTP protocol. And this makes it a very easy to use mechanism or method in firewalled environments, because due to the HTTP protocol, it uses port 80 and 443. And that usually makes it a lot easier to get the firewall rules in place in your even secured environments. If we're talking about NITRO in this presentation, I'm not talking about the beer and the fun that you can have with NITRO as well, but I'm focused on the RESTful service of the NetScaler, which is fondly called NITRO by Citrix. And this allows us to communicate with the NetScaler even in a programmatical way, and use HTTP-based interaction. And one of the other great options with NITRO is that Citrix also offers different SDKs that you can download from the appliance for most popular programming languages. If you want to get started with NITRO, basically what you need is a NetScaler 9.2 or later. And I'm hoping that most of you are already on a later version and not still trying to make NetScalers work with the 9.2 version. What you need is an account to authenticate yourself on the NetScaler that has at least execute permissions. And of course, you need to be able to access your NetScaler through the NetScaler IP address or subnet IP address. And as I mentioned before, REST APIs are based on a client-server architecture where the service runs on the NetScaler, but you still need a client side of the communication. And you can choose to either use a REST client like CURL, or my more personal favorite is Postman, because it gives me a GUI and a quick way to double check if I have URLs correctly, if I'm making the right call, to see what kind of error messages might be returned. And as I mentioned before, you can also use a programming language that has REST support. And Citrix makes this very easy to offer different SDKs on the download section of your NetScaler appliance. And in my case, I like to use PowerShell because it integrates nicely with all the other automation tasks that I run in my Citrix infrastructure. Getting back to RESTful APIs, as I mentioned, an API is based on HTTP protocol, which means that I need to provide quite some information before I can make an HTTP call. Because with the HTTP protocol, you need to provide a verb, a URI, specify which HTTP version you're using, and also offer some data through the request header before you can actually communicate your message content through the request body. If we translate this to making a REST API call or to making a NITRO call, you'll notice that I still need to make sure that I have all that information available for that call. So I also need to specify the HTTP method And this can be either get, to retrieve information from the NetScaler. It can be post, to push new information to the NetScaler, put, to update existing information, or delete, to remove information from the NetScaler or configurations. And the second important part is to specify the URI, or in this case, the URL. And the URL always starts with HTTP or HTTPS for secure connections. Then you have to specify the NetScaler address /nitro/v1. That's just to get started, because you need to provide a lot of information for NITRO to understand what you want to do. So the first thing with a NetScaler that you need to be aware of is that you have two kinds of informations that you can address. You can either address the configuration of the NetScaler by adding /config to your URL, or you can retrieve, in most cases, statistical information by specifying /stat. In the demos in this webinar, we're mostly focused on the configuration, so I'll mostly use /configuration in my URL. And the next thing is that NITRO needs to understand what resource you want to address. So in this example, I want to address the NetScaler features. And for those of you that have already working with NetScaler and NetScaler configurations, you might be aware of the fact that with NetScaler features, you basically have two different actions or operations that you can perform. You can either enable or disable a NetScaler feature. So we need to make sure that NITRO also understands the action that we want to perform. So this is another piece of information that you need to provide with the URL. So hopefully, even though it is a lot of information, this will help you to quickly build the right URL for your API call. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we still have two pieces of information that we also need to provide with our call. The first one is some metadata in the request header. And in this case, I'm using a generic content type in my request header, specifying application/JSON. And this metadata lets NITRO know that the content of my request body is formatted in a JSON payload. And that gets me right to the request body information. The JSON payload basically contains all the information that I either configuration or statistical information that I want to push to my NetScaler, to NITRO. And as you can see in the example on the left, this is just a login information. So I'm sending my username and password to authenticate myself on the NetScaler and build my first session. If we're looking at the example on the right, it's an example to basically create multiple load balancing servers on my NetScaler. I do realize that this is a lot of information to get in, to understand. So what you will see in this presentation is that I'll return to basically this very important overview. Because to summarize the information that you need to make a REST API call, these are all the pieces of information that I just shown you, like the URL, the method, the header, and the payload information. And this is, of course, still a lot of information to retrieve and gather. So I think it's a good thing to let you know that Citrix, in addition to the SDKs that you can download from your NetScaler appliance, they also offer an API reference document guide for NITRO that you can also download from your NetScaler appliance, or even go to the developer site that Citrix has, where you can find the latest version of the REST API documentation. And what you'll notice if you look at this documentation is that it also is divided in a configuration and a statistics section. And if we zoom in on the configuration, you'll see all the different resource types that you can address with the call. And if we even zoom in further on the NS feature resource type, it will give you an overview of all the operations that you can perform, like the enable and disable action. And for each operation, you get a full overview of the URL, the HTTP method, the header, and the payload formatting as well. So this will make life a lot easier if you want to play around with the REST APIs and NITRO on your NetScalers. So I think so far we still have most of the people with us, Dave, or did I already make it hard to follow?
No, everyone's there and everyone's looking interested. There's one comment that came through actually, which I think is a really good idea. It's from a guy, Chad. Sorry, I'm going to butcher this name. Busser, I think.
Okay.
Apologies there if I did. It was. Is there a community where we can post our code and code problems to, please? So kind of like, we're thinking like maybe along the lines of a GitHub or something like that, that people can put their code up and maybe others can contribute. I thought that was a good idea.
Yeah,
maybe
definitely.
We could look at setting
so
up.
I'll make sure that at the end of the presentation, I'll show you where I'm putting all the code, so you can get a quick head start with the demo that I will show you in this far later on. And yes, that is all posted on GitHub to make sure that I can share it with the community, get feedback on it, and maybe even make it a community project to develop even more scripts. And the other section is, like I mentioned in the source URL on this page, is that you have the developer documentations on citrix.com, which is a separate section focusing on DevOps, which has a lot of different guides and probably give you some pointers as well. So make sure that you check those pages out as well. So moving on to the next section. As I mentioned before, I'm using mostly PowerShell as my programming language to make sure that I can integrate my NetScaler automation with the other automation tasks for my Citrix structure. And if we're looking at PowerShell, there are a couple of commandlets that will make life easy to get started with REST API calls. So the first thing to know is that PowerShell has a built-in command called invoke_REST method, which allows you very quickly to make your first REST API calls to the NetScaler. And the thing that you need to know with the invoke_REST method is that it has a separate parameter for making that first call, which is called session variable, that allows you to get the returned information, which usually if you authenticate and log on to the NetScaler for the first time, you want to get all that session information because it returns a token, so you can reuse that in additional API calls that you make. And invoke_REST method allows you to store that in a session variable, and if you make a second call, you can refer to that session variable with the web session parameter, so you don't have to re-authenticate yourself with each and every call that you make, but you can reuse the session that you built to the NetScaler. And the other parameters are, as you might already have guessed, focused on providing all that information that you need to make your REST API call, like the method, the URI, the content type, which is a header information, but in this case, it's a separate parameter that you can just simply specify. And last but not least, that JSON payload. And if we look at the JSON payload, there are a couple of things that you need to take into account. First of all, there are some slight syntax differences between JSON and PowerShell arrays and hash tables, as you can see on this slide. But the good news is that we also have a commandlet called convert to JSON that allows us to quickly build our information, our JSON payload, with PowerShell arrays and hash tables, and just use the convert to JSON commandlet to quickly convert it to correctly syntaxed JSON payloads. So that will make life a lot easier by building your array and then or hash table and then converting it. There's one thing that you need to take into account is that the convert to JSON payload has a very important parameter called the depth parameter. And this parameter has a default value of 2, which means that it will only convert your hash tables and arrays, which can be nested, 2 levels down by default. So in the example that I'm showing here, it will not convert the port name correctly because those are at a level 3. So if you make sure that you add the depth parameter, in this case I'm using 5 to make sure that I get all the levels down correctly converted, it will convert the port names correctly into your JSON payload. So that's a very important lesson that I wanted to make sure that I shared with you all. So let's look at how we can use all this information for our NetScaler management. And I'm just very quickly gonna basically run you through how I grew into NetScaler management. So my first experience with NetScaler ADC were obvious to use the management console, which was the web-based console that allowed me to quickly enter the configuration information, just hit the OK buttons and would magically configure my NetScaler. So that's like basic getting started one-on-one on NetScaler management. And of course, for those that felt more accustomed with the NetScaler and became basically more bold, you also had the SSH option to send command line commands or CLI commands to your NetScaler directly, not using a management console. So this presentation will not focus on the SSH that much, because one of the things that I discovered through some Citrix blogs that were posted a couple of years ago is that the NetScaler ADC management console, or the NetScaler itself, uses RESTful service. And the management console basically translates all the information that we put in the forms into a NITRO call, which is sent to the NetScaler ADC RESTful service. So with the blog post that I read about this new development, I quickly realized that there could be a better way to manage my NetScalers than to use manual actions through the management console. So I started to play around with NITRO and the REST API calls, and quickly discovered that I could directly use REST API calls to my NetScaler RESTful service and use that to basically configure the same settings on my NetScaler. The only thing that I needed to take into account is, in case of different network segments, is that if there was a firewall between my management system and the NetScaler ADC, I needed to make sure that port 80 or 443 or both were opened up in the firewall to make sure that I could connect to the NetScaler and push NITRO to it. And the other thing that I discovered is if you're using multiple NetScaler ADC devices in your environment, you would still require all the different firewalls ports to be opened, and you would still have to fire off your NITRO calls to each and every NetScaler ADC individually. So the good news is that Citrix introduced the NetScaler ADM, the Application Delivery Management appliance, I think about 2 years ago, and or it was formerly known as NetScaler MAS. So the NetScaler ADM basically offers us a centralized management appliance. It also does a lot of analytics, but for this presentation, I'm more focused on the management options because up till this moment, or at least it's still basically license free. So you don't need additional licensing to use all the management functionality of the NetScaler ADM, which makes it a very powerful appliance to introduce and to make your management life easier if you have multiple NetScalers in your infrastructure. So what happens with the NetScaler ADM, which of course also has a management console, is that I can now address the functionality of the NetScaler ADM or the features, and ADM will communicate back in the background to the NetScaler ADCs using NITRO or SSH commands. And basically, if I have more than one NetScaler, I can now still make the same calls to my centralized system, requiring only one set of firewall rules between my management system and the ADM. And I can have the ADM manage multiple NetScaler devices. So that makes it a more secure solution, basically, for your infrastructure than the need to address each and every NetScaler directly. And the good news is that as the ADM is also a NetScaler appliance, it also runs a RESTful service, which allows me once again to directly push NITRO or REST API calls to my ADM and not need manual actions in the NetScaler ADM console. Easy as that. And another good news is, as you know that by now that REST APIs require a lot of information, is that there's also a separate NITRO API reference guide for the NetScaler ADM or NetScaler MAS, because I have to admit I did not upgrade to the latest version just yet in my home environment. And as with the NetScaler API reference or the ADC reference, this one also focuses on all the different resource types that you can address and give you an overview of all the functions or operations that you can perform and give you that same URL, method, request payload and response payload information. So that should help you to get started automating basically NetScaler ADM as well. So let's look at NetScaler ADM and NITRO in a more in-depth way. So for looking at functionalities or using NITRO with ADM, the first and obvious usage, of course, is to make sure that we address the ADM functionality. In this case, I want to add a NetScaler ADC as a managed device to ADM. And I can simply do that by providing the right URL using not the NetScaler IP address, but basically NetScaler MAS or ADM IP address, /nitro/v1/config, and then do /manage_device. That's basically the resource type on ADM to add a managed device or a NetScaler ADC to ADM. And as you can see in the payload, there are some subtle differences between NetScaler ADC NITRO and NetScaler ADM NITRO. Because with the ADC appliances, we usually put the action in the URL. But with ADM, it is a part of the JSON payload as one of the parameters. As you can see, we now specify action as add device. And then we provide the managed device information as the IP address and the profile name. And the profile name basically, just checking if I highlighted that. So the profile name basically is the information that ADM uses containing your username and password for the NetScaler ADC. So it has the right, it can use the right credentials to authenticate against the NetScaler ADC and use NITRO to communicate the configurations. So this command basically allows us to use NITRO with ADM and use the ADM functionality. But there are some other cool ways to use ADM as well. And one of the other cool ways is that you can use ADM as a so-called API proxy. And basically what that means is that I can now push NITRO, which is destined to communicate with NetScaler ADC, but I'm using the ADM device as a proxy. So basically I'm sending my NITRO commands to ADM. It will be processed by ADM and then pushed forward to the NetScaler ADC that I want to address. And this allows me to quickly change or reuse the scripts that I previously built to manage my NetScaler ADCs by sending NITRO calls directly to the NetScaler, but now using the centralized managed device for that. And if you want to use NetScaler ADC as an API proxy, you need to make just a couple of minor changes to the REST API call. So the first one is in the URL. You're still specifying the URL for the NetScaler ADC, as you can see by the action, which is still in the URL. So normally I would do HTTP or HTTPS, then do the NetScaler IP address /nitro/v1/config, etc., etc. But now I'm replacing the NetScaler IP address in the URL with the IP address of the ADM, because that is the device that this NITRO call has to be pushed to. And then I need to make sure that ADM is aware of the fact that I want it to act as an API proxy. So I need to make sure that ADM knows which NetScaler managed instance I want it to forward this call to. So in order to do that, I need to add an additional parameter basically to the header, to my HTTP request header, specifying the NetScaler IP address. And in this case, it's a very long MPS underscore API underscore proxy, etc. Parameter, which I found in the NetScaler ADM documentation on the Citrix documentations. So this is just one. I can use either an IP address or an instance ID or an instance name, if I'm not mistaken. But just to make sure that I always hit the right NetScaler ADC, I just prefer to use the instance IP address. And then in the JSON payload, I'm adding the same payload I would do with a direct NITRO call to the ADC appliance. So in this case, it's the NS feature, so I'm enabling the load balancing, SSL, and the VPN or the gateway functionality of the NetScaler. And as I mentioned, I'm not sure how many of you already have some experience with NetScaler ADM, but there are a couple of distinguished features or management functionalities of the ADM that can be very helpful in your automation tasks. So the first one is called maintenance tasks. And maintenance tasks are basically built-in sets of commands based on the CLI commands, so using SSH, that Citrix already pre-built in ADM, which allows you to perform different maintenance tasks like upgrade firmware, or in this example, create a NetScaler HA pair by just providing the two IP addresses of the two NetScaler appliances that you want to be configured in the HA pair. So if we're looking at the management console interface, it requires you to specify a task name, a primary IP address for the primary NetScaler appliance, and a secondary IP address for the secondary NetScaler appliance. And this can easily be translated, and I have to admit I had some communications back and forth with Citrix engineers to make sure that I understood the different resource types that I needed to and to build my URL correctly. But basically this can easily be translated into a REST API call by using the URL that uses the resource type ns_ha_pair_template. And yes, that had to be, I had to be told that by Citrix, but you can find it back in the API reference guide. And in the payload, I'm basically providing almost the same information as you need to provide through the GUI. So I need to specify the primary IP address and the secondary IP address of the NetScalers. And then basically just make the call, and then the maintenance task is being started, is being kicked off on ADM, which makes sure that all the configuration is pushed to those specified NetScaler ADC appliances. And one thing to notice is that if normally, if you look at the instances on ADM, the NetScaler ADC instances, you will notice that it just specifies each NetScaler ADC by IP address. But the minute you have created an HA pair, it's no longer just an IP address. It's basically what I like to call a combined IP address. So it looks like an IP range formatting, but basically I'm just referring to that as your display name for quick references. And it will always be the primary IP address minus the secondary NetScaler IP address. And if you want to make sure, because if you want to make configuration changes to an HA pair, you need to address the primary node. To figure out which one of those two is the primary node, you need to check out the host name, because that will always show you either by IP address or by the actual host name of your NetScaler appliance, which appliance is the primary node. So that will make it quick to address the right NetScaler. The second very important feature of ADM is what we call configuration jobs. And configuration jobs, for those who are familiar with Command Center, basically are scripted jobs of CLI commands. So this will also use SSH to communicate with the ADCs. But the cool thing about configuration job is that you cannot just specify the different CLI commands, but you can also use variables in the CLI commands, which makes it more powerful and more dynamic to basically build configuration templates, put in variables in all the positions that are device or instance specific, and then specify them once you use the configuration template and you want to run those commands. So if we translate that into a REST API call, you'll notice that I need to provide quite some information because it's built in different sections. As you can see, the resource type is configuration_job. I need to specify, of course, a job name. And then I need to specify each and every command in that configuration job. So it can become a very long JSON payload if you have a lot of commands in your configuration job. And what I notice in the GUI is that you can use so-called configuration templates to make it easier, because you can basically drag full blocks of CLI commands. For NITRO, you need to specify each and every command with each and every configuration job that you create. So there's not an easy way to quickly link to configuration templates in this case. And for those of you that are looking at the payload code, you'll notice that it has two different sections of variables. So the first section within the template information is basically the specification of each variable, specifying the name and the type of the variable. Let me quickly check. So this one specifies the subnet IP address as a variable, which is a text field. And in order to also specify the values for each variable in the configuration job, there is a second section called variables in your JSON payload, which for each variable really specifies the value of that variable. I hope that still makes sense. So if we run the configuration job, we can easily check an execution summary on the ADM device and even zoom in at a command level log, which shows us each and every command that was pushed to the NetScaler and whether or not it was processed successfully. And now we're getting to the really cool and new and fun feature of what, or at least in my opinion, on NetScaler ADM, which is called custom stylebooks. And if we're looking at custom stylebooks, you'll notice that it gives us basically a new way of creating a simple web form, which allows us to build custom web forms for administrators that are less experienced, or maybe even web developers that we want to give a granular level of configuration control of our NetScalers, because this allows us to simply build our own web form, as I mentioned, basically consisting of a parameter section where we specify different text boxes, select boxes, and then we add values to them. Then what I do like about the stylebooks is that in this case, if we're looking at the payload, it starts with configuration pack, because that's what you need, or that's what you create basically, because you can also manage those configuration packs later on with ADM. Checking out the JSON payload, prior to that, let's look at the URL, because that is a bit different than the standard URL formatting. So it starts with the NetScaler ADM IP address, and then it uses /stylebook, because as this is a new feature, basically it has its own engine running within the RESTful service of the NetScaler. So to make sure that we are aware of that, we need to add stylebook in front of NITRO. And you need to be aware of the fact that each stylebook is uniquely identified with 3 pieces of information. The namespace, which basically is a self-proclaimed namespace that you can use to basically categorize your different custom stylebooks. A version that allows you to run multiple versions of a stylebook on the same ADM appliance, and a name. And those 3 create a unique combination for each stylebook. So that's why you're addressing that pieces of information in the URL as well. And then if we look at the payload, you need to specify the target devices. So you need to specify which NetScaler ADC appliances you are pushing this information to. And in contrary to the configuration jobs where we were just specifying NetScalers based on IP classes or the display names, with stylebooks we need to identify each NetScaler appliance based on a NetScaler ID. So in my scripts, I'm using a quick REST API call to retrieve the ID and then focus on the, and then I can use that within my call. And then the second section is basically all the parameters that I build in my stylebook, and I have to make sure that they each have a value. So far that's kind of basic once you get a hang of stylebooks. And the one thing I do like about stylebooks, and that's basically what I wanted to say a couple of minutes ago when I got all excited, is what I really like about stylebooks is that they are more dynamic than configuration jobs. So configuration jobs basically allow you to use variables to make them a bit dynamic. But if we're looking at stylebooks, it allows me to basically add either 1 server in this case, or multiple servers. So I can just simply click on the plus in the form and just add a second server to it. And as I mentioned, we're basically creating configuration packs that allows us to update configurations very quickly, view the configuration that is created, or quickly delete the entire configuration by removing the configuration pack. Oh, I was wondering if you were going to ask a question, Dave, but I'll just quickly go to the demo because I'm noticing that even though I am very excited and fast with my explanation, I want to make sure that I show you everything in action, because I do realize that this is information. Yes, Dave.
Just one thing.
Yes.
A couple of things actually. The attendees are still like massively high, so obviously word is getting out about all the good stuff you're giving out here, which is great. The other thing, there was a comment earlier saying only for 10 or 20 servers with the ADM you need to pay for licensing. Just
okay. Yes, I will quickly address that.
Yeah.
I will show you quickly what the demo is all about, because we will focus on some of the aspects of the ADM. If we're talking about licensing, the reason why I say that the management functionalities is still free of charge or doesn't require any licenses, that's because the only thing that you need to license, and that's the 30 fee server license pack that comes for free with the is that you need to license the analytics part of your NetScaler ADM. So if you want to use it basically as a replacement for your insights information, and you want to retrieve the analytics information on your fee servers, you need to have license packs installed for that. And the first 30 fee servers you can, let me try to explain it better. There is a license pack for 30 fee servers included with the ADM. So that's the one you get for free. And then if you need more than 30 fee servers to get your analytics information, you need to buy additional license packs. So I think that's explained it perfect.
Yeah, something on that as well. By default, in the ADM, when you install it, it's going to have a tick box in auto select every virtual server you import. So if you pull a NetScaler in with more than 30 V servers, you're going to use up those licenses. You can turn that off and individually select.
Yeah, so I'm quickly just switching to. So basically, this is the part with the licensed virtual servers where you can do auto select. So it will just each fee server it detects on your NetScaler ADCs will just be ticking off one license, or you can switch this off and you can specify each and every fee server yourself. So that makes it very interesting. And the other thing that I didn't specifically address is that your ADM can also be a license server for your NetScalers, basically allowing you with bandwidth licenses to specify a check-in, check-out system, which I will show in the demo. So for my demo environment, I'm still using Zen Server, so I do hope that you will forgive me for that. I have already created 2 NetScaler ADC appliances, which are basically brand new, and of course my NetScaler ADM appliance, which I'm showing you right now. So if we're looking at the NetScaler ADC instances, you'll notice that there are no instances just yet. And I will kick off the script and walk you through the different steps that basically I addressed previously. And I'm just checking. So the first step basically was to create those NetScaler VPX appliances or import them on my Zen server environment. But I already did that to save some time during the demo, because I didn't think it would be most fun to just watch or wait for 4 minutes before the appliances are imported. So if we kick off the script, basically those 2 steps are skipped. And then if we're looking at step 2, I'm going to add the VPX appliances to ADM. And basically what I'm doing is I'm using the managed_device resource type in my REST API call. And if I kick off this step, and I hope everyone can basically see the screen, what I did with each and every step is to make sure that I specified the URI with each and every step, and I made sure that the payload is shown as well. So that will give you a quick idea of the resource type or the URI that I used in this example and the payload. So as you can see, I'm adding just 2 NetScaler IP addresses as managed devices with a default profile and the action at device. So if we go back to the NetScaler ADC, refresh the screen, you'll now notice that I have 2 NetScaler appliances as managed devices. So we can now move on to the next step of the script, which basically is to configure a license server on the NetScaler. And I will just kick it off very quickly because you'll notice, and I think most of you are aware of that, the minute you change some license information on your NetScaler, you also need to reboot the NetScalers. So in this case, I'm using MAS as an API proxy for the reboot because I want to address the reboot directly and not use the reboot functionality of ADM. Because if I address the reboot command directly on the ADC, I can make it a warm reboot. And unfortunately, that is not something that I can specify on ADM right now. So I'm hoping that this will quickly reboot my NetScaler ADC appliances. So in the meantime, I will quickly go back to the, go back to the URI that I used. As you can see, I'm using resource type NS license server, specifying the NetScaler ADM IP address as my license server. And I also need to specify, in this case, a central management server, which is the ADM, to make sure that I authenticate with a username and a password. But the very important part is that I also need to specify the NetScaler capacity, which is the bandwidth license that I'm specifying. So if we now go back to ADM, to the license section once more, you'll now notice under VPX licenses that I now have 2 NetScaler instances there. So the license server is configured on the NetScaler, and it is communicating with ADM to check out a license, basically. And if we're looking at allocation state, it now states optimum, which basically indicates that this is a managed device. You can also choose to only use ADM as your license server. And in that case, it will show here, make a statement that it's an unmanaged device, but it's still checking out a license. So that makes this a very powerful option as well. Of course, I want to quickly show you a couple of other functionalities, as I mentioned in the slides already. For instance, the maintenance task to create an HA pair. So I will quickly move this up a little bit. So what I'm doing is I'm using that NS underscore HA pair underscore template resource type, and I'm specifying a primary IP address and a secondary IP address, and basically making sure that I get from the response, figure out whether or not the task was performed successfully. So if we go back to ADM and go to configuration jobs, maintenance job, it will also show that the HA pair job was completed successfully. So I still have one more step to show, if I'm not mistaken. Oh, even 2 more. So the maintenance task is the built-in CLI commands from Citrix, but you can also build your own configuration job. And in after talking to the Citrix architects, basically what they're saying is that configuration jobs are best used for global or system-wide settings on your NetScaler, where the stylebooks are more focused on application level settings or fee server level settings. So what I did is I created basically a sample configuration job for those basic settings. So, and if we quickly look at the, hoping that this will work with me, quickly look at the configuration job settings. As I mentioned before, one of the things with the JSON payload is that each and every SSH commands need to be included in your payload. So that can make your payload quite a long list of CLI commands. So that's something to take into account. So let's kick off this configuration job for some basic settings on my NetScaler. And then just quickly remove that one. Going back to ADM, going back to configuration job, it now states that that job is completed. And if we zoom in to the details, it will show you that all 50 commands were executed successfully. And if we look at the command log, I can even see that for each and every command. No, I probably have to remove this. So one final automation task to show you, which is a custom style book. So basically what I did is I created a couple of style books in this example. I have one to upload certificates because I found that there were still a couple of bugs in the earlier version of the SSL functionality or the certificate dashboard of ADM. So this allows me to make sure that I just specify a certificate file and have it uploaded to the NetScaler. And then I have a custom stylebook to create a load balancing configuration. So if I kick this off, it will first upload those certificates. And we can quickly see how that's going. So looking at the stylebooks, these are basically the custom stylebooks that I created. And the good news is, if I quickly change this one, go back to stylebooks, is that Citrix already offers a lot of built-in stylebooks that you can use for content switching, for ADFS proxy. So there are a lot of stylebooks to choose from. But in my case, I wanted to make sure that I had full control of all the NITRO commands that it's pushing to my NetScalers. So I built my own custom stylebooks. Quickly going back to configurations, we should have 3 configuration packs. The bottom 2 are for those certificates that are uploaded. But the top one is for the load balancing fee server. And as I mentioned, what I like about configurations is that it, or customs, the configuration packs, is that it shows you all the objects that were created on my NetScaler. And to quickly test if the configuration is working, let me just quickly go to this link. And we should have 2 different servers that are being load balanced, as is shown here with the 2 servers. And what I really like about the stylebooks, as I mentioned before, is I can quickly click on the configuration, and now I have my custom built web form, and it is already filled with all the information that I put in the stylebook. So if I now remove, I was gonna remove this one. If I remove this, one of those servers and hit on, click on OK, it will now recalculate the configuration changes that I made and push those configuration changes to the NetScaler. So if all went well, and I keep refreshing it, I now only have 1 server still up and running. So that makes a configuration pack a very powerful management tool for those administrators that also need a GUI. So to show you just how powerful it is. I think I took this one. So I now, oh, hang on. Picked the wrong one to add, so that will not make a difference. So now I have two servers again in the backend. Hitting OK again. And see if I now get the green server back. So basically that's how easily you can change your configurations. And I'll add some additional configuration scripts to this as well in the near future. So basically that's all the demo that I wanted to show. And as I promised you, to make sure that each and everyone has a quick start with NITRO, I made sure that I have a GitHub repository where I post all the different scripts that I'm playing around with, either directly for NetScaler configurations or for NetScaler ADM. But as you can see, by the time I created the GitHub repository, it was still called MAS. So basically, I only have one question left, Dave. Are there still some questions that we can address?
I think we're pretty good. We've had, there were some questions about allocating licenses for the MPX or SDX using NMAS.
Okay.
Which we can pick up, and then the rest of the stuff is people want your demos and want this recording. There's a lot of questions around how long the recording is going to be available, where it is.
Oh, perfect. Well, that's all stuff that Stephanie can definitely address.
Yeah. She already did. She answered it just before me.
Perfect.
So apologies for that.
Yeah, I do apologize for running a bit over time, as I just realized that.
There's also some stuff around some people want some stuff on the basics of NetScalers, which I said maybe we can pick up with a networking SIG.
Oh, perfect.
Try and get some sessions done on that. And a lot of thank yous. Thank you very much. Great demos. Fantastic. Thank you.
Well, it was our pleasure and our fun. So I'm very happy that each and everyone sticked around, even though I went a little over the specified time. So thank you. And all that's left to say is to wish you a very good day or good evening, depending on your time zone, and hope to catch you in the next user share that Stephanie posted definitely on Twitter.
Thank you very much, guys. That was great. Yeah, I think you guys covered everything I was pretty much going to say, except follow us on Twitter. The recording will definitely come to you guys tomorrow in an email from GoToWebinar, and I will I put a link in the chat to the forum thread for this webinar. So what I'll do is I'll go through and put any of the Q&A that's in there. I'll put that in the forum thread, and Esther and Dave, if I need any clarifications, I may come to you for that afterwards.
Happy to help.
Thank you. And then also in the chat is a link to our survey. It's short and anonymous, and it's just for CUGC use only. So we love to get your feedback on today's webinar and ideas for future webinars. So please fill that out when you get a moment. And other than that, I think we can let you all get back to your evening or your day. Thanks again, Esther, Dave. Appreciate you guys being with us today.
Not a problem.
You're very welcome.
All right, well, that is it. I hope everyone has a great rest of the day, and we'll see you on another CUGC webinar again soon. Bye.
Thanks, bye-bye.